Good morning. We are still in our Ruth series. Last week we are studying chapter 1 and today we are now in chapter 2. So before I start my sermon, who among you here love watching wedding videos on YouTube? Yeah, especially that part when they exchange vows, right? That is the sweetest moment when the groom expresses that vow towards the bride and the bride also respond. And there's always common line when you watch those vows. Yes, that's a that's a common line, but usually they have this line that I never thought of, di ba? That God would lead me to you, or God would allow us to meet each other and everything. And then usually they say everything makes sense now. Why you're here. So today, we're gonna study with the same thought as that. When Ruth and Naomi able to say, now this is the reason why God allowed all those things to happen. So, before I start, I would like to remind you again, because this will keep on repeating, the Moabite word. Ruth as a Moabite, it will keeps on repeating. It means that they are cursed by God. You remember that in chapter 1? Being a Moabite is considered the enemy of the Jews. And they're cursed by God because in the first place, from the line of Moab, he is a product of an incestuous relationship between Lot and the daughter. So in the first place, they're already cursed by God. So we will move on with chapter 2. So I would like to read to you verse 1. Now Naomi has a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. In chapter 1, we end up with two characters. That's Naomi and Ruth. And now in chapter 2, there's a new character that's being introduced. First is Boaz. And I like how the writer laid down everything in just one verse. He said that a clan of Elimelech. And we will discuss that later on, why this word is important. And whose name was Boaz. So new character is introduced. His name is Boaz. His name mean in him is strength. That is an Hebrew name. So this gives us an idea that not all leave the country. Boaz stayed. He didn't die. He survived. You remember the famine? That's the reason why the family of Elimelech moved from Bethlehem to Moab. And God prospered Boaz, a man who God prospered greatly. Boaz was a wealthy landowner in Bethlehem who lived when the judges ruled. So this is the time when people think that their feeling is the truth. You remember that in chapter 1. So here alone in verse 1, we saw the life of Boaz. There's truth that's being dropped here, that even in times of difficulty, even in times of challenge, when your outside circumstances begins to threaten your welfare, God is able to take care of you. We saw that in the life of Boaz. Boaz survived amidst those outside circumstances, and that is famine. Here, Boaz is addressed as a worthy man. So we have now an idea that he is honorable, well-respected in the community. Boaz was a man of substance, having both personal wealth and reputation. And above all, this is a truth that's being dropped as well, that Boaz, a relative of Naomi's deceased husband, Elimelech. So this gives us an exciting feeling that, oh, there's a redeemer here. Because there's a law in their times that when your husband died, a brother will take the responsibility as a husband. But if there's no brother, the close relative of that brother. And here's now Elimelech. So this is exciting. So in verse 2, And Ruth, notice this, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." So we have now here what is Ruth and Naomi in need of. First, they are in need of food because of the famine. Next is they're in need of family because they don't have someone that's left for them to protect them, to supply for them, because they're both widow and they don't have children. There's also barren. So Ruth, the Moabite, is always the emphasis of where she came from. And then she asked for permission to Naomi. "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." She said glean. This is an Old Testament command. This is God's welfare program. This is taking care of the poor. This is in Leviticus 19, 9 to 10, that the harvest should not be reaped to the kerners, nor the gleanings picked up. Gleanings were stalks of grain left after the first cutting. These were dictated to the needy, especially the widows, orphans, and strangers. So there's challenge that we saw here when it comes to gleaning. First is challenge to the farmer, to the owner, to be generous. So the owner should intentionally leave something for the poor. And there's also another challenge to the poor, to be active and work for their food. And then they can do it with dignity. Because God commanded that they will be provided. So they have the right to go to the field. But here, there's an awkwardness when it comes to Ruth. Because first, Ruth is a Moabite. She's not a Jew. She's a foreigner, outsider, in other words. So she asked permission. And then this is the longing of Ruth, in whose sight I shall find favor. Ruth is aware of the tension that she is a foreigner. And Ruth is fully aware what is going on between a Moabite and the Jews. Yet she moved forward hoping to find favor. And she just didn't that sit there and do nothing. Then Naomi said, "Go, my daughter." In verse 3, so she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come, notice that words, to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was the clan of Elimelech. There's an emphasis again who Boaz is. In other words, who would have thought? Who would have thought that as big as those field is, God would lead Ruth to this field belonging to Boaz. And this is exciting. And we're excited for Ruth. And the story is about to intensify what we're going to happen. As a reader, this gives us a feeling of excitement because we know who Boaz is. We know where Ruth is being led by God. But in the shoe of Ruth and Naomi, they don't have any idea what's gonna happen. For us, it's exciting. But for them, they continually trust God. And notice the response of Ruth here. Ruth trusts God. She go to the field with attention. She don't know what will happen to her. And she trusts God that she will find favor to this unknown landowner. So we have now in verse 1 to verse 3, we have now an idea that nothing happens by accident. Everything happens by appointment. That God is divinely ordained every details of your life for His glory. No accident in our lives. Even this haze, this sickness, people going to hospitals, accidents, everything is under His sovereignty. Here, Naomi and Ruth is in need of food. But in chapter 1, Ruth displayed radical abandonment, leaving the land where she came from and leaving her people and her God, from land of compromise to land of promise. Ruth said her commitment ultimately to God and her love to Naomi. Now, look at this. Ruth continued to trust God's provision. Going into a field without any idea what's going to happen to you, what you have, what motivates you to go there is your trust in God, that God will provide. And that motivates Ruth. She moved forward, hoping that she will find favor from a known landowner. Then God leads her to a field owned by Boaz. Ruth don't have any idea yet why it happened or the importance of that event, but as a reader, we're excited for them. In our lives today, we are blessed to have His Word, the Bible, made available for us 24/7. Just like Ruth, are we intentional in going to the field and glean? To sit down and study and obey? Do we see our state always in famine spiritually? In need of spiritual food? Or in our pride, we thought we're always safe? Or, okay, I'm healthy. I don't see myself in need of food, especially spiritual food daily. Naomi thought that God will only provide food for physical need. Little did she know that God is preparing food for our souls through Christ forever. And this is exciting even for us. And we move on in verse 4. And behold, I like how the writer continues to excite us. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Boaz's character is revealed here. This shows exceptional godliness of Boaz and his workers. Boaz came from Bethlehem. It seemed that he lived in the city and owned fields there where Ruth was gleaning. And just by this greeting alone, we have an idea that Boaz was a man of God. He was not cruel to his workers. They have respect for him. This was an ideal relationship between the owner of the land and the worker. And we have a glimpse now of the character of Boaz. First, we are introduced with a new character, and that's Boaz. And we have a glimpse of the future, that he is from the clan of Elimelech. And now the author draws us deeper. Boaz's character, who Boaz is. In verse 5, then Boaz said to this young man, who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" So Ruth caught the attention of Boaz. When you watch a movie, there's this a part where they slow-mo everything. Yeah. And then their eye meet each other. Yeah, that's the sweetest thing. And then the guy will wonder, who's that girl? And here, Boaz got the attention of Ruth. And he asked, "Whose young woman is this? To whom does she belong? Or what family is she? Whose daughter is she? Or whose wife?" Perhaps her dress might be somewhat different from those of the Israelite women. But Ruth has caught the eye of Boaz. We may assure that Ruth is beautiful. Might be one of the Hebrews caught in bad times. That's what Boaz may be thought of. In verse 6, and the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Notice the word next. Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. Double torture. Gi-emphasize gid og maayo sa author. And the reply is young Moabite woman and who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And when you deliver that word to Boaz, that word alone, young Moabite from Moab, Boaz will have now the idea who this woman is. And she's with Naomi. And notice what Ruth said after in verse 7. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Now Ruth pleaded to allow her to continue gleaning from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Now we have a picture of Ruth as hard-working individual. Ruth is in need of food. And here, God provided food for her. And not just for her, but also for Naomi. And Ruth sees that moment. She works hard. And in verse 8, notice the response of Boaz. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen." And notice this word after, "My daughter." Oh, na daughter zone siya. "My daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young woman." Notice the response of Boaz here. Boaz is fully aware who the Moabites are. What is the tension between Moab and Israel? That Moab is cursed by God, that Moab were sinners. And Boaz's response displays that he is truly a man of God. "Now listen, my daughter." He treats Ruth as a daughter. Address Ruth as a daughter. "Do not go glean in another field," now here's the favor, "or leave this one, but keep close to my young woman. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young man not to touch you?" Notice this. Not to touch you, there's protection. "And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Now there's provision. Notice the response of Boaz. She welcomes Ruth and address Ruth as a daughter. Not just that, he offers protection. And not just that, he offers provision. And when you go back to chapter 1, what is the response of the village when Ruth and Naomi arrived in Bethlehem? They were stirred. And then they were asking, "Is this Naomi? Who is this woman? Is this a Moabite woman?" And they're really aware of the tension between them. And here, Boaz don't push that forward, that she is a Moabite. But instead, Boaz showed grace, mercy, and love. Boaz is aware of two facts. Ruth is a Moabite woman. She came back with Naomi from Moab. Boaz's response is Boaz give provision and protection. What did Boaz see for Ruth to receive those things? That's a question. Or what made Ruth even deserving of those good things? Ruth didn't do anything to earn that favor. It was freely given without using her being a Moabite to withhold it. Boaz may have been attracted to Ruth, but here he behaved appropriately. he showed grace and affection without taking advantage of Ruth. Now what a character is that? And in verse 10, this is the response of Ruth. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" The response of Ruth, she fell on her face, bowed, and asked, "Why have I found favor? I am a foreigner, Moabite to be exact, enemy of Israel, cursed by God. Why?" What Boaz see? And then in verse 11, there's the response of Boaz. But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done from your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before." Now Boaz is now aware of her testimony, her conversion, her turning away, her repentance. And I would like to quote Paul Washer here. The evidence of salvation, the evidence of repentance, the evidence of faith is a change and a changing life. And we saw that in the life of Ruth. First, he go to the field trusting God that God will provide. Trusting God that God will protect her because she's a foreigner. And then God led her to this field. The question now is, if the world will look into our lives, will they see change? Just like what Boaz saw to the life of Ruth. Will they say that there's a difference between a Christian and non-Christian when they just examine our lives? Or will just say, there's all the same. There's no change. There's no difference. And notice here the commitment of Ruth, her radical abandonment. That's what also Boaz is putting into light. How we commit to spiritual discipline, to abide in the word of truth, to growth of our spiritual fruit, to joyful obedience, to sacrifice for God's glory, to love others faithfully, and His church, just like what Boaz see, will the watching world see it clearly. And I would like to go deeper. Will those visiting NCC will able to see what, like Boaz saw, change? Will they see Christ ultimately working in us, or just like the same organization or club outside? And let's continue. In verse 12, "The Lord repay you for what you have done." This is still Boaz. "A full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Now Boaz not just welcomed Ruth. Boaz saw how God works to the life of Ruth, her conversion, her testimony, and that radical abandonment. And for Boaz, knowing all this information, this is remarkable for him to hear those vital information that he gathered, who this Ruth is. And in verse 13, this is the response again of Ruth. "Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant. Though I am not one of your servant. And if you notice in verse 14, they're not connected. This is the same response as Ruth voiced out her commitment towards God and Naomi, and it leaves Naomi speechless. And here it leaves Boaz speechless again. She found favor, and then she received kind and comfortable words. Her very heart is refreshed and revived. Though I am not your servant. And then Boaz was stunned. There's a gap between 13 and 14. So what we saw here, Boaz saw the tremendous change in the life of Ruth. And ultimately, Boaz saw Christ working in the life of Ruth. And in verse 14, and at mealtime, so this is another setting, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat. Eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. So in verse 14, here's now Boaz welcomes Ruth to be part of the fellowship. Boaz invited Ruth at the table. Boaz is serving her even at his table with the aim that until she was satisfied. Boaz continues to show acts of love, grace, and mercy, breaking the foundation between the Moabites and the Jews. Here, Boaz welcomes Ruth, eat with her, and serve her with a goal to bring her into satisfaction. She had some left over. This is Ruth saying, "This is more than enough. I'm already satisfied, but there's still food that's left." When we are under the care of a sovereign God, being satisfied is underrated. More than enough is the word. We are given this undeserved favor of being invited at his table, being served, and ultimately being satisfied. Do we continually see daily in our lives, when we open our Bible, do we see the undeserved favor that God inviting us to commune with him? In our darkest moment, do we continually seek satisfaction in his attributes? In our happy moments, do we continually praise him in his attributes? And that's crucial for us. And in verse 14, no, verse 15, when she rose to glean, Boaz didn't stop. Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves. Do not reproach her. All the more there's favor. And also, put out some of the bundles for her." Now there's acts of practical love here. There's intentionality. Tuyuan ninyo og tagak, nga sumangil og tagak-tagak. Also pull out some from the bundles for her and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. What kind of favor is that under the care of Boaz? Ultimately, what Boaz saw in the life of Ruth is her radical abandonment, her radical commitment unto God, and that made Boaz all the more respond, being grateful that this is a living testament that God is working through our lives. And then in verse 15, so she gleaned in the field until evening. So the character of Naomi never changed. She's still hardworking. Then she beat, that is thresh, to separate seed seed from mechanically, out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah. That is about 22 liters of barley, and that is heavy. And notice in verse 18, this is how strong Ruth is physically. And she took it up and went into the city. Oh, what strength is that? It's like 1.5 of that gallon, the back. And then Ruth is bringing that. She took it and then went into the city. And not just that. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. Not just that gleaned, produced barley, but also that food, that leftover food. And that's hard-working Ruth is. This is a picture of Ruth carrying that heavy load of provision. But not just that, but also food she had left over after being, notice this, satisfied. Not a leftover depriving himself not to eat more, but after being satisfied, more than enough. And we saw here, could it be in the middle of our sorrow and suffering that God is plotting for our satisfaction? And in verse 19, this is exciting. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Let's pause here for a moment because it's really exciting. Ruth is gleaning. And then Naomi is asking, "Where did you glean?" Ruth doesn't know the significance of Boaz. Naomi knows who Boaz is, but she doesn't know whose field Ruth is working. And this is exciting. The main information is still yet to unfold. Now in verse 19, so she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "That man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And picture the reaction of Naomi. Boaz? And this is like a picture in a movie, right? Usual when they drop the major information, there's always that something that falls to the ground, and I don't understand why. The character may be holding something like a glass of water, and then when the information is being told, boom, the camera will zoom into that glass of water, and then that glass of water faces the floor and it breaks into pieces. And then the camera will zoom back to the face of the character. Boaz. And this is really exciting. And notice the response of Naomi here. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." In a previous chapter, chapter 1, Naomi wanted to change her name from pleasant to bitter because she said that God's hand is against her. And here's now the response of Naomi. Now everything makes sense to me. Now why all of these things happened? Because God already planned that this will happen for us, for His glory. And notice the response of Naomi, whose kindness has not forsaken. God is there all throughout, the living or the dead. This is an information overload for Naomi. She looks back, connects everything. And here's now the reason why there's a glimpse why everything happened. I thought that God is running away and forget me, and Lord, here I am. But now, Naomi rather, is fully aware that God's hand is there, working every details of her life. Kindness has not forsaken the living and the dead. This is a picture of loving kindness, grace, and mercy. Naomi begins to understand God's sovereign working, covenant loyalty, loving kindness, and mercy towards her. And there's still crucial information that we need to know. Naomi also said to Ruth, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our Redeemer. All the more this is really exciting. Not just Naomi know that God is sovereign. Here's God continually pouring out, revealing His plan towards their life. This is a close relative, our Redeemer. The great kinsman-redeemer, this kind of theme begins here. The close relative could redeem. This is in an Old Testament. A close relative could redeem a family member sold into slavery, could redeem land which needed to be sold under economic hardship, and redeem them, give them a family name by virtue of a levirate marriage. This is a marriage which the brother or the close relative of a deceased man is obligated to marry his brother's widow. And now Ruth have all the more hope to look forward. They are in need of food. And Ruth and Naomi is now being satisfied. They are in need of family, and it is about to unfold. In verse 21, and Ruth the Moabite, here's still again the word. Besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with this young woman, lest in another field you will be assaulted. Now here's the reality. So she kept close to the young woman of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. And this is the kind of ending that's so bitin. What? It ends here? I want more. So they're given this privilege to continue gleaning from the start of barley to wheat harvest. That's about 2 months. And when they glean, it will be more than enough for both of them. And it ends up with a very anticlimactic word, and she lived with her mother-in-law. And that's the end of chapter 2. And you're like, oh, I want them to go back again and to continue. What will happen to Ruth and Boaz? So what do we learn from here? The way Ruth is written is intentional. You notice the words. It's very intentional to show us that God is working behind the scenes. The character in this story is ultimately revealing the character of God to us. We don't see God explicitly mentioned here. What is revealed is picture of the character of God that help us understand the gospel. First, what do we see here? He seeks the outcast as family. This is Boaz. Boaz don't use Ruth's past as factor to withhold what is due to her, because it is Ruth's right to glean. because that's God's command for stranger, widow. His love is not dependent on what someone has to offer. His mercy being poured is not because we deserve it, but because Boaz delight in those things. This is familiar to us. Romans 5:8, but God demonstrates His own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. This is a demonstration of that love. Another thing is, He shelters the weak and how Ruth is protected. He did not just welcomes us into His table, but He provides protection, knowing that we are weak and He is the source of our strength, security, and food. And we saw here the picture of God, that God delights in our weakness. All the more I boast about my weakness, so that the power of God will dwell within me, because His grace is sufficient through my weakness. And here Boaz demonstrating that protection, knowing that Ruth is in her weak state. Another thing we saw here is He shows acts of grace, love, and mercy to the needy, and even served the hungry at His table. Boaz received it, we know, from God. And because God satisfies us with love, grace, and mercy, thus His action overflows with the same love, grace, and mercy towards others, and that is Christ-like. And we are called to be Christ-like. And this is how Boaz demonstrates that likeness, that love that he received ultimately from God. Another truth that we saw here is he becomes our refuge. The picture of a mother bird sheltering the young and the fragile with her wings. And this is us, we are fragile. When we face hardship, sufferings, we usually freak out. The normal reaction of Ruth and Naomi. We became paralyzed because of those overwhelming outside circumstances. But God offers shelter, refuge. Remember Psalm 91? He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of Almighty. And in verse 4, and under His wings you shall find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. Being under His refuge is more than enough, because always His goal is to lead us into satisfaction. And that's the kind of benefit that Ruth is delighting on, and thus her response is worship. He bows down, and she even said that, who am I? I'm not deserving of all of this. I am accursed by God. I'm a sinner. I am considered enemy. And then here you are showing your mercy, your love and grace towards me. Then who I am. And this is a picture of us towards God. We are sinners, alienated, violated God's command, deserving of His wrath, deserving of His divine wrath and divine judgment. Yet God, in our state, loves us first. And we continually thank God for that daily. Another thing that we saw here, He has satisfied our longings. In verse 2, you notice, the longing of Ruth is, in whose sight I shall find favor. That's what motivates Ruth, that God will provide, that God is Almighty, that God is Shaddai, El Shaddai, supremely sovereign. And in verse 13, here's what happened. I have found favor in your eyes, in the eyes of Boaz. And this is the fulfillment of what she's praying for. I've been longing that in those unknown field, God will lead me to this field of satisfaction. And this is my heart's desire. This is the desire of Ruth. Ruth, in the deepest of her heart, that's his constant plea to God. Because of her state, she's a foreigner. That's what Naomi said, you might be assaulted. But God display his favor in the sight of Ruth. I found favor in your eyes. And Boaz lead her to satisfaction. And that is the gospel here in Ruth chapter 2. And for us, this is also a challenge to continually display that acts of love, acts of mercy, acts of grace, that in our own strength, we can't do it. That in our own limited mind, no matter how we plant it, we cannot execute it. But God said, I am the shelter for those who are weak. And we continually run to Him as our source of strength. We continually run to Him as a source of love, as a source of mercy, as a source of grace. And so this is a challenge for us when we open our Bible. First is, do we see ourselves in need of His Word? Or do we say, I'm already satisfied? And that's continuous lie that we say, I'm satisfied. And when we open our Bible, do we like Ruth, gleaning until the end of the night? We sit there and study and obey His Word. Or are we just contented going to Bible studies every Sunday? Do we go deeper to our relationship, us and to God? Just like in our human relationship, the more we know someone, if we spend time with someone, the more we know her, the more we know him, based on his or her reaction towards things, what he or she likes, what he or she don't like, how she respond to these things. And that is what God wants us to do. God is continually offering Himself. Know me, know me, know me. And even though in our sinful and carnal heart, God continue to surprise us that He is there, just like in the life of Naomi and Ruth. They were ultimately surprised with this tremendous plan of God starting to unfold little by little. Why God allowed all those things from the start to happen. And now God brings them to that great delight that God is indeed there working every details of our life. This gives us a comfort that when we are in need, we are in suffering sickness, that God's hand is continually working. Before I end, I would like to share to you that God is indeed working into our life. This is a city that I hate of. Cebu City. I don't like to be here. And my first job is in Bohol. Second job is in Cagayan de Oro. And then I became empty. I wanted my spiritual life to be aligned of whatever who God is. And then there's a job that's being offered, but before that there's other job that's being offered, and I'm tempted to grab it. But I wanted to know who God is in my life. Then God leads me here. And then God leads me in NCC. And God leads me to know Him all the more through the lives of one another. and people guide me how to study His Word. And this is like the life of Ruth. When you look back into your life versus today, just like what is the opening statement, when you count everything, our whole life is not just enough to count every blessing that God is being pouring out into us. All the more, there's a challenge to continually trust Him, to continually abide under His wings, that we are being protected. So let us pray.